I'm reminded of a conversation I eavesdropped on. An African, not a Nigerian, was talking about somebody who had said there are no skyscrapers in major African cities. And this person got very upset and said, there's skyscrapers in Nairobi and in Lagos. And I remember listening to that and thinking, the problem with this is that somehow this African had accepted that skyscrapers should be the basis on which to measure development. We need stories so that we can resist the trap of allowing our aspirations as Africans to be shaped by others. I'm a king, yes. English is mine as much as Igbo is mine. I write in English because English is the only language in which I can write, which in turn is because the language of education in Nigeria is English. In primary school, we were not allowed to speak Igbo in class. It was called speaking in the vernacular. And the word vernacular was wrapped in shame. I look back now at the absurdity of it, and also the great sadness of it, how colonialism's most insidious legacy is its ability to make you denigrate that which is yours. But many of us did not succumb to this ignoble shabbiness. And in my case, I think it was because of the stories my father told us. My father was a radiant storyteller, and he spoke a beautiful Igbo. He told stories of his childhood and folk stories and stories his father had told him. I loved the proverbs, the wit, the humor, the wisdom, and I would soak them all up, absorb them, store them, and I began to feel a distinct sense of pride about the Igbo culture from which these stories came. Pride at my good fortune to have come from a wise and humorous and enterprising and just people. An almost epic sense of personal history, which caused me to assume my place in the world as unquestioned, just naturally so. I see now, looking back, that I could very well have been an annoying child. And yet, I wish the adults who had formal authority over me had known how to guide my questioning. Many of my questions were about religion, or more specifically about the Catholic Church, because I was raised Roman Catholic. My family's Catholicism was moderate but conservative, the African permutation of Roman Catholicism with its subtle and not so subtle disparagement of pre-Christian Africa. To be baptized, for example, you had to choose an English name because the reasoning was English was Christian and African languages were not. Years later, as an adult, when I decided that I no longer wanted to have an English name, an acquaintance said to me, "So you won't have a Christian name?" To which I said, "I do have a Christian name, it's Ngozi." I'm fascinated by the genuine embrace of a religion brought to you in the most irreligious way, as part of that harsh, soulless dictatorship called colonialism. I'm fascinated by a source of comfort that can also distort your life, by the ease to extremism, being righteous but not being right. My first novel, Purple Hibiscus, has a father character whose blind Roman Catholic religiosity has terrible consequences for his family. After it was first published, I was often told by Americans and Europeans that my novel was a political allegory, that my abusive father character represented Nigeria's brutal dictator. Why, I wondered, must my characters represent something political? Obviously, I know the reasons that modern African novels have their roots in the anti-colonial struggle, and that so little African writing is known outside Africa that the easy response is always to read it first as political anthropology, rather than as a story of human beings. But it does not change the truth, which is that when I sat down to write the father character in Purple Hibiscus, I was not thinking, I shall now write an important allegorical representation of Nigeria's military culture. Instead, a character had come to me with a hushed voice and an almost broken spirit. A teenage girl who was nothing like me and who I wanted to explore. I should clarify that my questioning this was not because I disagreed about my work being political. I agreed that it was. Rather, I questioned it because it seemed that some writing was read this way and others were not. And this distinction was based not on the content of the writing, but on the personal history of the writer. A kind of categorizing based not on literary judgments, but on lazy cultural assumptions. So at book events, I can always tell who is studying African literature from their questions. And these are the questions that least interest me because of their insistence on everything being postcolonial, because of their deadening preoccupation with theme rather than character, and because of the realization that characters in African novels are not likely to be conceived as sources of delight, or that they're too often seen as characters to whom bad colonial things happened. Bad colonial things did happen, indeed, are still happening. And yet, I long for my characters to be seen, as Toni Morrison said of her characters, as characters who are unavailable to pity. This tendency to read African literature as anthropology or as political allegory fills me with a kind of wistful resentment, especially when I hear students speak of their favorite of Louisa May Alcott's women, or which of Jane Austen's characters were really badass. I'm sure I'm outdated, but at least 15 years ago, this was the norm, 10 years ago even. And I would often be frustrated at not being asked about love and despair and human motivation and all of those complicated human things. I was so sick of being told that somehow my characters were about dictatorship or whatever the hell else. And so in addition to politics and anthropology, I have discovered that part of being an African writer in the world is to be expected also to be an activist. I've often been told, of course, you must write about the political situation in your country, or actually in other countries. Someone said to me not long ago, why haven't you written about Congo? And what I did not say to that well-meaning person was, because actually I want to lie in bed and read poetry. Because this is true, I do want often to lie in bed and read poetry. But at the same time, I do also often write about the political situation in my country. I recently wrote a public letter about the Nigerian elections because I wanted to tell the story of what happened. And telling the story of what happened has become important in a world so eager to deny and distort even recent history. I wrote it to bear witness. I want to bear witness because I can. And because I can, I believe I must. But I don't think a fiction writer must necessarily be politically engaged, especially an African one. The only role of the writer, wherever they come from, is to write literature. To be back in my village today is to feel a sense of an almost atavistic belonging. It is quite simply my home. It is where I want to be buried. I can roam as far as I want because in my mind, there is a home waiting, always there. The highlight of those Christmases in the village during my childhood was the masquerades. The big masquerades appeared with much noise and music and commotion, and children were filled with excitement at going to see them. They were violent, flogging one another with long sticks and sometimes thick ropes, and they were beautifully grotesque. One Christmas, the big masquerade, which was called Agwonatumbe, which I should translate, it means the snake that does something to the tortoise. I just realized the translation doesn't sound terrifying enough, but this masquerade was terrifying. And it appeared only once in many years. I was excited until I was told I could not join my brothers at the gate to peek out as this masquerade went past. Why? I asked. Well, because girls can't. The stark and unrelieved unfairness of this made a huge impression on me as a child. It also felt like one of the many things adults did that just wasn't very sensible. It was my introduction to the parts of Igbo culture that decreed that simply by being born female, you were automatically excluded from so much that was beneficial. You could not inherit property. You could not participate in the most prestigious ceremonies. You could not have an equal say. The Igbo people pride themselves on historically being an island of democracy in a sea of autocratic kingdoms. And so, just as we speak of universal ideas when we mean male ideas, ancient Greece as the cradle of democracy, even though women could not vote, and we speak of the Renaissance, even though women were excluded from intellectual life, and we speak of the Enlightenment, even though women could not control their property nor have higher education, so too Igbo land. It was indeed decentralized and democratic, but it was a male-only democracy. This story of the masquerade is one I pull out from time to time to illustrate a kind of political awakening to my existence in the world as a woman. It is a convenient story and a true story, but it is incomplete because it is too simple. My awakening happened before then. I had already observed the tiny nuances in language, how a professor, for example, was called strong, and a woman professor like him was called arrogant. How a relative whose husband brutally beat her was told to go back and beg him because a woman without a husband was nothing. I already knew that it was women who died of broken hearts, not men. That women were socialized to give value to romantic relationships in ways that men were not. Children notice subtleties at very early ages. I did not, of course, have the language for what I sensed and saw. And it was years before I came to know that word feminism, which for me is a way of dreaming of a more just world. That great African icon, Thomas Sankara, said, "The revolution and women's liberation go together. We do not talk of women's emancipation as an act of charity or out of a surge of human compassion. It is a basic necessity for the revolution to triumph." And I wish that African leaders today would read Thomas Sankara. I recoil whenever I am described as a feminist writer. I am not a feminist writer. I am a writer who is also a feminist. To add the label of a movement before the word writer is to take a rusty, jagged knife and hack at the sublime. A story is a very powerful thing. Stories can take away dignity, but stories can also restore dignity. Stories shape politics and perception. I cannot tell you how many times I've been told by people from different parts of the world after reading my novels that they finally started to see Nigeria, really see Nigeria. After my second novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, was published, I was stunned by how many people embraced it as their own personal history, those who had experienced the Nigerian Biafran War. At my readings, women would start to cry and say, "Thank you for telling the story and for finally making it possible to tell my family what I went through." Men would get choked up talking about how they had been conscripted as boys. Young people would get emotional talking about how they finally understood their parents. I will never forget how moved I was to read many years ago. Nelson Mandela described Chinua Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart. He called it the book in whose presence the prison walls came down. In this way, literature becomes more than itself. Today, African children go to elite boarding schools and learn about Greek mythology. But what is the difference between Persephone, the Greek goddess of planting seeds, and Allah, the Igbo goddess of land? It is merely that one story has been told well and the other has not. It is through stories that we can turn our myths into memory. I'm reminded of a conversation I eavesdropped on. An African, not a Nigerian, was talking about somebody who had said there are no skyscrapers in major African cities. And this person got very upset and said, there's skyscrapers in Nairobi and in Lagos. And I remember listening to that and thinking, the problem with this is that somehow this African had accepted that skyscrapers should be the basis on which to measure development. We need stories so that we can resist the trap of allowing our aspirations as Africans to be shaped by others. I'm not advocating a defensiveness, but rather a proactiveness. Because even the idea of a nation is also about stories. A nation is not geography. A nation is psychology. A nation is really about shared beliefs. A nation without a strong sense of itself cannot thrive. And so we need stories in order to know ourselves. I like to think of literature as my religion. Reading does not necessarily make us have empathy for others, but it can. And by far the greatest lesson I have learned is how we are more alike than not. That we may show love differently, but we all love. That what matters to us may differ, but we all want to matter. That it is as important to extend grace as it is to expect grace. And that dignity is always as important as food. When Bessie Head was asked the question, why do you write? Her response was this: I am building a stairway to the stars. I have the authority to take the whole of mankind up there with me. That is why I write. Thank you.
I'm a king, yes, I'm a king, I think I'm a king,